When a Navy SEAL's peaceful dinner with his daughter becomes a moment of truth, will he break his promise to leave violence behind to protect a stranger? One viral video will change everything. The amber glow of Riverview Grill's pendant lights cast long shadows across weathered wooden tables, creating an atmosphere that whispered of simpler times. Jack Foster sat across from his 10-year-old daughter Sophie, watching her animated face as she described her day at school with the boundless enthusiasm only children possess. Her chocolate-brown eyes, so much like her mother's, sparkled with mischief as she recounted how she'd outsmarted the class bully during recess. And then Tommy tried to take Emma's lunch money again, Sophie said, twirling spaghetti around her fork with practiced precision. But I told him that picking on smaller kids just proves you're weak inside. You should have seen his face, Dad. Jack's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against calloused palms that had once gripped assault rifles in distant lands. At 38, the former Navy SEAL carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd walked through fire and emerged tempered, not broken. His steel-gray eyes held depths that spoke of battles fought and brothers lost, but when he looked at Sophie, they softened with a love so profound it ached. "That's my girl," he said, pride evident in his gravelly voice. "Your mom would have been proud of how you stood up for Emma." Sophie's fork paused mid-twirl. "Do you think she's watching us, Dad, Mom? I mean..." The question hit Jack like a sniper's bullet, unexpected and devastating. 3 years had passed since Sarah's death. 3 years since cancer had stolen his wife and Sophie's mother with merciless efficiency. Yet grief remained a constant companion, sometimes dormant, sometimes clawing at his chest with fresh intensity. "Every day, sweetheart." He managed his voice thick with emotion. "Every single day." The restaurant buzzed with the comfortable din of evening diners. Families shared meals, couples leaned across tables in intimate conversation, and the soft jazz playing overhead created a soundtrack of normalcy. For Jack, these moments with Sophie represented everything he'd fought to protect during his 15 years of military service, the simple freedom for a father and daughter to share dinner without fear. "Dad, can we get dessert?" Sophie asked, her earlier solemnity forgotten, with the resilience of youth. "The chocolate cake here is legendary. That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says, and she knows about legendary things, because she's been alive forever." Jack chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. Laughter had been scarce since Sarah's passing, but Sophie had a gift for coaxing smiles from the darkest corners of his soul. "Mrs. Rodriguez is 73, not ancient, and yes, we can get cake. It's Friday night after all." As Sophie launched into an elaborate description of her weekend plans, which apparently involved building a fort that would make the Pentagon jealous, Jack found himself truly relaxing for the first time in weeks. The construction company he'd started after leaving the Navy was finally gaining traction, providing enough stability for him to consider Sophie's request for a puppy. Maybe it was time to embrace this new chapter of their lives fully. The peaceful moment shattered like glass against concrete. "Come on, beautiful. Don't be shy. A girl like you shouldn't be drinking alone." The voice carried across the restaurant with the entitled arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Jack's head turned instinctively toward the bar, his combat-honed senses immediately cataloging the situation. 2 men in expensive suits flanked a young woman who sat rigidly on her bar stool, her knuckles white as she gripped her wine glass. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun and wearing a tailored blazer that suggested legal or corporate work. Her posture screamed discomfort, shoulders hunched defensively, eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating escape routes. She was clearly alone and clearly unwilling to engage with her unwanted suitors. I appreciate the offer, but I'm waiting for someone, she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor Jack detected beneath the surface. It was the voice of someone trying to maintain composure while fear crept up their spine. The larger of the two men, a broad-shouldered brute with perfectly styled blonde hair and a Rolex that probably cost more than most people's cars, leaned closer, invading her personal space with predatory confidence. Waiting for someone. That's a shame, because my friend Danny here owns 3 restaurants in the city, and I've got connections that could open doors for a pretty little lawyer like you. How do you know I'm a lawyer? The woman's question came out sharper than intended, revealing both intelligence and growing alarm. Catherine Mitchell Wright, just made junior partner at Morrison Kessler and Associates. The second man, Danny, apparently smiled with the cold calculation of a shark. He was leaner than his companion, but carried himself with the same entitled swagger. Word travels fast in our circles, especially about beautiful, successful women. Catherine's face paled. These weren't random drunk guys hitting on a woman at a bar. This was targeted, planned predatory. Jack's muscles tensed involuntarily, 15 years of military training flooding his system with adrenaline and tactical awareness. Dad, Sophie's voice seemed to come from far away. Dad, that lady looks scared. Jack's eyes snapped back to his daughter, seeing his own concern reflected in her young face. Sophie had inherited more than her mother's eyes. She'd also gotten Sarah's fierce sense of justice and protective instincts. At 10 years old, she could already read situations with unsettling accuracy. She does, doesn't she? Jack murmured, his gaze returning to the unfolding scene at the bar. Catherine had set down her wineglass and was reaching for her purse, clearly attempting to leave. But the larger man, Jack, mentally catalogued him as Alpha. The leader placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, preventing her departure. Now hold on there, sweetheart. We haven't even properly introduced ourselves. I'm Marcus Webb, and this is my business partner, Danny Volkov. Maybe you've heard of Webb Industries. We're always looking for talented legal counsel. Webb. The name sent ice through Jack's veins. Everyone in the city knew the Webb family old money political connections and rumors of business practices that skirted the edges of legality. Marcus Webb Jr. was the heir apparent to a fortune built on real estate development, city contracts, and what some whispered were ties to organized crime. I really need to go, Catherine said, standing abruptly. But Marcus's hand remained on her shoulder, his grip tightening visibly. What's the rush? The night's young, and we haven't even gotten to the good part yet. Marcus's smile never wavered, but there was steel beneath the veneer of charm. Danny, why don't you order another round? I have a feeling Ms. Mitchell is going to be much more sociable once she relaxes a little. The restaurant's other patrons had begun to notice the commotion, but their responses were predictably passive. A few concerned glances, some uncomfortable shifting in seats, but no one moved to intervene. Jack recognized the phenomenon from his military psychology training, the bystander effect, where individuals assumed someone else would take action, resulting in nobody acting at all. Except Jack had spent 15 years in situations where hesitation meant death, where the difference between action and inaction was measured in heartbeats and lives lost. His body was already moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. Dad, where are you going? Sophie asked, her voice carrying a note of worry that pierced straight through his chest. Jack paused, his hand resting on the back of his chair. This was the moment, the crossroads, where his promise to leave violence behind collided with every principle he'd sworn to uphold. He'd told Sophie repeatedly that their new life was about peace, about building rather than destroying. He'd hung up his uniform and buried his weapons, choosing the quiet dignity of civilian life over the brotherhood of warriors. But looking at Catherine Mitchell's frightened face, at the predatory confidence of Marcus Webb, at the willful blindness of every other person in that restaurant, Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, like an old familiar coat. "Stay right here, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "Don't move from this table no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded solemnly, her young mind recognizing the gravity in her father's tone. "Are you going to help her?" "Yes," Jack said simply. "I am." He stood slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding with the controlled grace of a predator emerging from cover. The casual observer might have seen just another restaurant patron getting up from his table, but someone with military experience would have recognized the subtle signs, the way he moved with economy and purpose, the manner in which his eyes swept the room, cataloging potential threats and escape routes, the loose readiness of his stance that suggested coiled violence held in careful check. As Jack approached the bar, the conversation had escalated. Marcus Webb's hand had moved from Catherine's shoulder to her arm, his fingers wrapped around her bicep, in a grip that was clearly causing discomfort. "Let go of me," Catherine said, her professional composure finally cracking to reveal the fear beneath. "I said no, and I meant it." "See, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart," Danny Volkov interjected, moving to block her path to the door. "In our experience, no is just the opening bid in a negotiation. Right, Marcus?" Marcus Webb laughed, the sound devoid of genuine humor. "Exactly. And we're very good negotiators, aren't we, Danny? We always get what we want one way or another." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Jack had heard similar words in interrogation rooms in Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen the same predatory gleam in the eyes of men who mistook power for righteousness. He was 10 feet away when Marcus Webb noticed his approach. The younger man's eyes flicked dismissively over Jack, taking in the worn jeans, the simple button-down shirt, the calloused hands of someone who worked for a living. To Marcus, Jack probably looked like just another blue-collar nobody, hardly worth consideration. "Excuse me," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. Years of addressing troops in combat zones had taught him how to project authority without shouting. "The lady asked you to let her go." Marcus turned fully to face Jack, his hand still gripping Catherine's arm. Up close, he was younger than Jack had initially thought, maybe 28 or 29, with the soft features of someone who'd never faced real hardship. His suit probably cost more than Jack made in a month, and his manicured hands had never known the weight of a weapon or the sting of honest labor. "And you are?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Someone who believes in treating women with respect," Jack replied evenly. Behind Marcus, he could see Catherine's eyes widen with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that someone was finally willing to help, fear that the situation might escalate beyond control. Danny Volkov stepped forward, positioning himself at Marcus's shoulder in a move clearly designed to intimidate. "This is a private conversation, friend. Why don't you mind your own business and go back to your table?" Jack's gaze flicked to Danny, then back to Marcus, his expression never changing. To an outside observer, he might have appeared calm, even relaxed. But beneath the surface, every system was coming online, muscle memory from countless operations, situational awareness, honed by years of combat, the cold calculation of a man trained to end threats quickly and efficiently. "Her saying no and asking you to let go makes it everyone's business," Jack said, taking another step closer. "So I'm going to ask politely one more time, let the lady go." Marcus's grip on Catherine's arm tightened, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. Being challenged publicly by someone he clearly considered beneath his social station was not part of his usual script. "Do you have any idea who I am, who my family is?" "I know exactly who you are," Jack replied, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the sudden silence that had fallen over the bar area. Marcus Webb Jr., heir to Daddy's real estate empire, used to getting your way through intimidation and family connections. What I don't know is why you think that gives you the right to put your hands on someone who clearly doesn't want you touching her. The accuracy of Jack's assessment hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went from flushed to pale, then back to red with mounting rage. You have no idea what you're dealing with here, asshole. My family owns half this city, including people who could make your life very difficult. Maybe, Jack acknowledged with a slight nod. But right now, in this moment, all I see is a man who can't take no for an answer. So what's it going to be? Are you going to let her go? Or do we need to discuss this further? The restaurant had gone completely quiet now, every conversation suspended as patrons watched the confrontation unfold. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to peer through the pass-through window, sensing the electricity in the air. Catherine found her voice, her legal training finally overriding her fear. Please just let me leave. I don't want any trouble. Neither do I, Jack said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. This can end right now with everyone walking away. Your choice. For a moment, Marcus seemed to consider backing down. His grip on Catherine's arm loosened slightly, and Jack allowed himself to hope that cooler heads might prevail. But then Danny Volkov leaned close to his friend's ear, whispering something that made Marcus's face harden with renewed determination. You know what? Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. I don't think I like your tone, and I really don't like some nobody telling me how to conduct my business. Without warning, he shoved Catherine aside, not violently, but dismissively, like discarding a piece of unwanted property. She stumbled backward, catching herself against a bar stool, her face a mask of humiliation and fear. There, Marcus said, spreading his arms wide in mock surrender. She's free to go, happy now. But Jack's attention had shifted to Catherine, noting the way she rubbed her arm where Marcus had gripped her, the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her purse. The physical discomfort would fade, but the violation of being manhandled and threatened would linger. He'd seen the same expression on the faces of victims in war zones, the hollow look of someone whose sense of safety had been shattered. Are you all right? He asked Catherine, his voice gentler now. I'm fine, she replied quickly, though her eyes said otherwise. Thank you. She moved toward the exit, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor. But as she passed Marcus, he spoke again, his voice pitched low but clearly audible in the hushed restaurant. This isn't over, Catherine. We'll be seeing each other again real soon. The words stopped her cold fear washing over her features like a physical force. Jack felt something dark and familiar stir in his chest, the same protective rage that had sustained him through firefights in Fallujah and Kandahar, the primal need to eliminate threats to the innocent. Actually, Jack said, stepping between Marcus and the exit. I think it is over. Completely over. Marcus's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. Who the fuck do you think you are? Some kind of hero? This is the real world, not some action movie. You have no idea what you're messing with. You're right, Jack replied calmly. I'm not a hero. I'm just a father having dinner with his daughter who doesn't like watching bullies intimidate women. The mention of Sophie sent a fresh wave of determination through Jack's system. His daughter was watching this unfold, learning what it meant to stand up for others, to choose action over apathy. What lesson would he teach her if he walked away now? Danny Volkov had apparently decided that words weren't working. Without warning, he stepped forward and placed a hand on Jack's chest, attempting to shove him aside. "Move along, tough guy. This doesn't concern you anymore." The touch was a mistake, a fundamental miscalculation that revealed how little Danny understood about the man he was dealing with. Jack's reaction was instantaneous and surgical, honed by thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat training and real-world application. He caught Danny's wrist in an iron grip, applying just enough pressure to the nerve cluster to send lightning bolts of pain up the younger man's arm. Danny's face went white, his knees buckling slightly as Jack held him in place with minimal effort. "Don't," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Don't make this something it doesn't need to be." The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, but it fundamentally altered the dynamic in the room. Marcus Webb's confident bluster evaporated as he watched his larger, supposedly tougher friend reduced to whimpering compliance by a man who hadn't even raised his voice. Jack released Danny's wrist, and the younger man stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest. The message was clear. This wasn't some civilian contractor or weekend warrior. This was someone with serious training and the confidence that came from having used it when lives were on the line. "I think you gentlemen should call it a night," Jack suggested, his tone conversational, but underlaid with steel. "Go home, sober up, and maybe reflect on how you treat people who can't fight back." Marcus's face cycled through rage, humiliation, and calculation before settling on cold fury. "This isn't over," he said, echoing his earlier threat to Catherine. "You have no idea who you just fucked with." "Maybe not," Jack acknowledged. "But I know who I am, and I know what's right. That's enough." The two men moved toward the exit, Marcus supporting a still-shaken Danny. But as they reached the door, Marcus turned back one final time. "Jack Foster," he said, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Former Navy SEAL, lives at 1247 Oak Street with his daughter Sophie, who attends Jefferson Elementary. Owns Foster Construction, which has 3 city contracts currently under review." The blood in Jack's veins turned to ice. The casual recitation of his personal information was a message: "We know who you are, where you live, where your daughter goes to school. We can reach you anytime we want." "Interesting bedtime reading," Jack replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "But knowing someone's address doesn't make you dangerous. It just makes you a stalker." Marcus smiled, the expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "We'll see about that, hero. We'll see." With that, the two men disappeared into the night, leaving behind a restaurant full of stunned diners and the thick atmosphere of unresolved violence. Jack stood motionless for a moment, processing the implications of what had just occurred. By standing up to Marcus Webb, he'd potentially put not just himself, but Sophie in danger. "Sir," the bartender, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying temples, approached hesitantly. That was a brave thing you did. But those Webb boys, they don't forget. They don't forgive." Jack nodded grimly. "I appreciate the warning, but some things are worth the risk." He turned to look for Catherine, but she was gone, probably fled during the confrontation with Danny. He couldn't blame her. Getting involved with the Webb family was like stepping into quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you sank. Walking back to his table on unsteady legs, Jack found Sophie exactly where he'd left her, her wide eyes tracking his movement with the intensity of someone trying to process events beyond her years. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked as he slumped into his chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb from his system. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "The lady was having some trouble, but it's handled now." Sophie studied his face with the uncomfortable perception of a child who'd grown up too fast. Were you scared? The question hit him unexpectedly, forcing him to confront the complexity of his emotions. Fear, yes, but not of Marcus Webb or his threats. Fear for Sophie, for the peaceful life they'd tried to build, for the possibility that his past might come crashing into their present. A little, he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand, her small fingers barely spanning his palm. Mom always said you were the bravest person she knew. Your mom was the brave one, Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. She fought harder than any soldier I ever served with. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the restaurant slowly returning to normal around them. Conversations resumed, silverware clinked against plates, and the world kept turning despite the brief eruption of darkness. Dad. Sophie's voice was small, uncertain. Yeah, baby. I'm proud of you. The simple words hit Jack like a physical blow, bringing tears to his eyes that he quickly blinked away. In 15 years of military service, he'd received medals for valor, commendations for leadership, and recognition from the highest levels of command. But none of it compared to the quiet pride in his 10-year-old daughter's voice. Thank you, sweetheart, he managed. That means everything to me. As they finished their dinner in the aftermath of violence narrowly averted, Jack's mind was already working through contingencies and consequences. Marcus Webb wasn't the type to let public humiliation slide, and the casual recitation of Jack's personal information suggested resources and connections that ran deep. But looking at Sophie's face, seeing the trust and admiration in her eyes, Jack knew he'd made the right choice. Some lines couldn't be crossed. Some principles couldn't be compromised regardless of the cost. The war was supposed to be over, but as Jack Foster sat in a quiet restaurant with his daughter, he realized that some battles found you no matter how far you ran. The question wasn't whether he was ready to fight again, it was whether he could protect the one person who mattered most when the inevitable storm arrived. Outside, the city lights twinkled with deceptive peace, and somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Webb was planning his revenge. The drive home through the quiet suburban streets felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that their peaceful existence had been irrevocably altered. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as he navigated the familiar turns, his mind cycling through tactical assessments and threat evaluations that he'd hoped never to use again. In the passenger seat, Sophie hummed softly to herself, blissfully unaware that their world had shifted on its axis. Dad, you're doing that thing again, she said, her voice cutting through his mental calculations. What thing? The soldier thing. Your jaw gets all tight and your eyes get that faraway look like you're seeing through walls or something. Sophie had always been unnaturally perceptive, a trait that had both amazed and terrified Jack since she was old enough to speak. Mom used to say you did that when you were worried about something big. Jack forced his shoulders to relax consciously, loosening his grip on the wheel. Sorry, sweetheart. Just thinking about work stuff. Huh? Sophie's tone suggested she wasn't buying it, but she didn't press further. At 10, she'd already learned to recognize when adults needed space to process complicated emotions. Their house on Oak Street sat in comfortable darkness, the porch light casting a warm glow across the small front yard that Sophie had helped him landscape the previous spring. The white picket fence she'd insisted on, because that's what families have towed, looked innocent and welcoming in the soft light. But now Jack saw it differently, cataloging sight lines and vulnerable approaches with the cold calculation of someone planning a defense. As they pulled into the driveway, Jack's phone buzzed against his leg. Unknown number, which set his teeth on edge given the evening's events. He let it go to voicemail, but it buzzed again almost immediately. Then again. You should probably answer that, Sophie observed, unbuckling her seatbelt. Might be important. Against his better judgment, Jack answered on the fourth call. Foster. Mr. Foster. This is Catherine Mitchell, from the restaurant tonight. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. Jack's blood chilled. What's wrong? They're outside my apartment building. Marcus Webb and that other man, Danny. They're just sitting in a black SUV across the street watching. They've been there for 20 minutes. The words tumbled out in a rush, fear bleeding through her professional composure. I called the police, but they said since they're on a public street and haven't actually done anything, there's nothing they can do. Are you safe where you are right now? I think so. I'm on the 4th floor and I haven't left my apartment since I got home, but Mr. Foster, I'm scared. The way Marcus looked at me when he said we'd be seeing each other again. Her voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavy between them. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. Sophie had gone inside the front door, closing behind her, with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the car. Give me your address, he said quietly. No, I can't ask you to do that. You've already done enough, and I don't want to drag you any deeper into this mess. Ms. Mitchell. Catherine, you didn't drag me into anything. I made a choice tonight, and I don't regret it. But these men aren't going to stop just because we want them to. Jack's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd faced similar situations in places where the stakes were life and death. What's your address? After a moment's hesitation, she gave him the information. The Meridian Apartments on the west side of downtown. A nice area, upscale but not flashy. The kind of place a young attorney climbing the corporate ladder might choose for its proximity to the financial district and relative safety. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Jack said. Stay away from the windows, keep your phone on, and if anything changes, if they move from that vehicle or approach the building, you call 911 immediately. Don't worry about whether the police think it's worth their time. Mr. Foster, I really don't think, Jack, and this isn't up for debate. 20 minutes. He ended the call and sat in the darkness of his driveway, wrestling with the implications of what he was about to do. Every instinct honed by 15 years of military service screamed that this was a trap, a calculated escalation designed to draw him deeper into Marcus Webb's web of influence and retribution. The smart play was to stay home, lock the doors, and hope that morning would bring cooler heads and rational solutions. But the image of Catherine's frightened face at the restaurant, the memory of Marcus Webb's casual recitation shone of his personal information, and the cold certainty that these men wouldn't stop until they'd reasserted their dominance over what they saw as their territory, all of it coalesced into a truth Jack couldn't ignore. This wasn't over, and pretending otherwise would only delay the inevitable confrontation. The front door opened, and Sophie appeared in the porch light, her pajamas decorated with cartoon unicorns that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. Dad, are you coming in? In a minute, baby. I need to run an errand first. She stepped fully onto the porch, her bare feet silent against the painted boards. It's about what happened at the restaurant, isn't it? The lady who was scared. Jack turned off the engine and got out of the car, marveling once again at his daughter's ability to read situations with uncomfortable accuracy. How did you? I heard you talking on the phone, and you get this look when you're about to do something dangerous. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking far younger than her 10 years. Are you going to be okay? The question hit Jack like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the possibility that his actions tonight might have consequences, extending far beyond a confrontation in a restaurant. Sophie had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The thought of leaving her alone in the world because of his need to play hero was almost unbearable. "I'm going to be fine," he said, kneeling down so they were eye level. "I promise you, sweetheart. I'm just going to make sure the lady from tonight is safe, and then I'll be right back." "Can I come with you?" "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than intended, causing Sophie to flinch slightly. Jack softened his tone, reaching out to touch her cheek. "This is grown-up business, okay? I need you to stay here, lock the doors, and if anyone comes to the house, anyone you don't know, you go to Mrs. Henderson's next door and call 911. Sophie nodded solemnly, but her eyes remained troubled. "Dad, when you said being brave means doing what's right, even when you're scared, were you talking about tonight?" "Yeah, baby, I was." "Then I understand why you have to go." The simple acceptance in her voice nearly undid him. At 10 years old, Sophie possessed a moral clarity that humbled him, an instinctive understanding of right and wrong that hadn't yet been corrupted by the complexities and compromises of adult life. "I love you," he said, pulling her into a fierce hug that smelled of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "More than anything in this world." "I love you too, Dad. Come home safe." 25 minutes later, Jack sat in his pickup truck across from the Meridian Apartments, watching a black Escalade that had been positioned with clear sight lines to the building's main entrance. The SUV's windows were tinted, but the glow of cell phone screens inside suggested at least 2 occupants. Professional surveillance would have been more subtle, which meant this was exactly what Catherine had described: a deliberate show of force designed to intimidate and control. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "4th floor apartment 4B. They're still there." Jack studied the building's layout, noting the parking garage entrance, the emergency exits, and the fire escape that zigzagged up the building's east side. The tactical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, automatically cataloged approaches and escape routes, while the civilian part wondered what the hell he was doing, playing soldier in a downtown apartment complex. He was reaching for his phone to call Catherine when the Escalade's doors opened. Marcus Webb emerged from the passenger side, straightening his expensive suit jacket with the casual arrogance of someone who owned the world. Danny Volkov climbed out from behind the wheel, still favoring the hand Jack had grabbed at the restaurant. But it was the third man who made Jack's blood run cold. Tall and lean, with the kind of casual menace that spoke of serious violence in his background, the newcomer moved with the predatory grace of a professional. Unlike Marcus and Danny's obvious displays of wealth and status, this man was dressed simply: dark jeans, black jacket, and the kind of boots that prioritized function over fashion. Jack recognized the type immediately. Military or ex-military, probably special forces given the way he carried himself. The kind of man who killed people for money and slept soundly afterward. Marcus Webb had just escalated the situation from intimidation to genuine threat. The 3 men conferred briefly beside the SUV before moving toward the apartment building. Marcus produced a key card from his jacket, probably obtained through family connections or simple bribery, and the glass doors slid open to admit them. Jack was out of his truck and moving before conscious thought caught up with his actions. Years of combat experience had taught him that hesitation in a crisis usually meant someone died, and Catherine Mitchell was alone in her apartment, with 3 men who clearly had no regard for boundaries or consequences. The lobby was elegantly appointed in the sterile, modern style favored by upscale developers, lots of glass and steel with strategic splashes of color that suggested sophistication without actual personality. A security desk sat empty. Apparently, the building's management had decided that key card access and cameras were sufficient protection for their residents. Jack bypassed the elevators, knowing that the stairwell would precede better tactical options if the situation went sideways. He took the steps 3 at a time, his body moving with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to operating in hostile territory. The 4th-floor hallway stretched before him in oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of air conditioning and the soft click of his boots against polished concrete. Apartment 4B was halfway down the corridor, its door identical to the others except for the soft glow of light beneath the frame. As Jack approached, he could hear voices from inside Marcus Webb's entitled drawl, Danny's nervous laughter, and underneath it all, Catherine's voice pitched higher than normal, with barely controlled fear. "Told you we'd be seeing each other again soon," Marcus was saying, his tone carrying the satisfied smugness of someone who enjoyed exercising power over others. "Funny how things work out, isn't it?" "I don't understand how you got in here," Catherine replied, her legal training evident in the way she tried to maintain professional composure despite the circumstances. "This building has security." "Security." Danny's laugh was harsh, artificial. "Sweetheart, my family owns the company that installed the locks on this building. Did you really think a door was going to keep us out?" Jack moved closer to the door, compressing his ear against the wood to better assess the situation inside. Catherine's apartment seemed to have an open floor plan, which meant limited cover, but also fewer places for the attackers to hide. The third man, the professional, hadn't spoken yet, which was somehow more ominous than if he'd been making threats. "What do you want?" Catherine's voice was steady, but Jack could hear the underlying tremor of fear. "What do I want?" Marcus's tone suggested he was enjoying himself, savoring the control he had over the situation. "I want an apology. I want you to admit that you were wrong to involve that asshole at the restaurant in our private conversation." "He wasn't wrong to help me," Catherine replied, and Jack felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "You were harassing me, and he did what any decent person would do." "Any decent person would have minded their own fucking business," Danny interjected, his voice sharp with anger. "And now look where we are. You could have avoided all this unpleasantness if you'd just been friendly." Jack's hand moved instinctively to his back pocket, where he kept a folding knife, a remnant from his military days that he'd never quite managed to stop carrying. The weight of it was reassuring, familiar, but he knew that introducing a weapon into the situation would escalate things beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Instead, he pulled out his phone and quickly composed a text message. "Are you alone in the apartment right now?" The response came back almost immediately. "No, they're here, please help." Jack took a deep breath, centering himself the way he'd learned in countless training exercises and real-world operations. Fear was natural, even useful, but it couldn't be allowed to cloud judgment or compromise effectiveness. Catherine was in immediate danger, and the longer he waited, the worse the situation was likely to become. He knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed down the empty hallway like gunshots. The conversation inside stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Jack could almost feel the sudden tension radiating through the door as the apartment's occupants processed this unexpected development. "Ms. Mitchell," Jack called, his voice carrying clearly through the thin apartment door. "It's Jack Foster, from the restaurant tonight. I wanted to check on you." More silence followed by the sound of rapid, whispered conversation that Jack couldn't quite make out. Then footsteps approaching the door, and Marcus Webb's voice pitched loud enough to carry, but strained with barely controlled anger. "Well, well. Look who decided to play hero again. Catherine, why don't you tell your knight in shining armor that everything's fine here? That we're just having a friendly conversation between old friends?" "Don't," Catherine started to say, but her voice was cut off abruptly, replaced by a soft sound that might have been a gasp of pain. That was enough for Jack. He stepped back and drove his shoulder into the door just beside the lock mechanism, putting his full weight and 15 years of military conditioning behind the impact. The door frame splintered with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward to reveal a tableau that confirmed his worst fears. Catherine sat rigidly in a leather armchair, her face pale but determined. Marcus Webb stood behind her, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder, while the other held her cell phone. Danny Volkov was positioned near the apartment's large windows, his nervous energy evident in the way he shifted from foot to foot. But it was the third man who commanded Jack's immediate attention. He stood near the kitchen entrance, perfectly balanced and ready to move, his hand resting casually inside his jacket in a way that suggested he was armed and comfortable with violence. "Trespassing," Marcus said conversationally, as if Jack's dramatic entrance was merely an interesting development in an otherwise ordinary evening. "Breaking and entering. That's serious crime in this state, Mr. Foster." "Is it?" Jack stepped fully into the apartment, his eyes never leaving the professional. "What do you call forcing your way into someone's home and terrorizing them?" "I call it a friendly visit," Marcus replied, his grip tightening on Catherine's shoulder. "Catherine invited us up for drinks, didn't you, sweetheart?" "No, I didn't," Catherine said firmly, her voice stronger now that Jack was present. "They forced their way in. They threatened me." The professional finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone who viewed violence as a tool rather than an expression of emotion. "You should leave, Mr. Foster. This doesn't concern you." "When a woman is being threatened in her own home, it concerns every decent person," Jack replied, noting the way the man's hand shifted inside his jacket. "And the way I see it, you gentlemen are the ones who should be leaving." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and artificial in the tense atmosphere of the apartment. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't some foreign battlefield where you can play soldier. This is the real world, where money and connections matter more than whatever medals you earned fighting people who can't fight back." The casual dismissal of his military service hit Jack like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford when Catherine's safety hung in the balance. "You're right," Jack said quietly. "This isn't a battlefield. It's supposed to be a civilized society where people don't have to fear being attacked in their own homes." "Civilized society?" Danny's laugh was sharp, nervous. "Look around you, hero. Civilization is what people like us create. Rules are what we say they are. And right now the rule is that you turn around and walk away, or things get very unpleasant for everyone involved." The threat was clear, hanging in the air, like smoke from a discharged weapon. Jack could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge, any wrong move likely to tip it toward violence that would leave people hurt or dead. "Catherine," Jack said, his voice calm and steady. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," she replied, though her white-knuckled grip on the chair's armrests suggested otherwise. They haven't hurt me. Yet." The qualifier sent ice through Jack's veins. These men weren't here for a conversation, or even simple intimidation. They were here to reassert dominance, to make it clear that crossing the Webb family carried consequences that extended far beyond a momentary embarrassment in a restaurant. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "You're going to leave Mr. Foster. You're going to forget you were ever here. And tomorrow, you're going to start looking for work in another city because Foster Construction's contracts with the city are about to be canceled. And if I don't," Marcus's smile was cold, predatory, "then my friend here is going to show you why people who cross my family tend to develop serious health problems." The professional shifted slightly, his hand moving deeper inside his jacket. Jack's muscle memory kicked in, cataloging potential weapons and cover positions, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived multiple firefights. "That would be unfortunate," Jack said, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "Because I really was hoping we could resolve this peacefully." "Peace is overrated," the professional said, finally producing what Jack had expected, a pistol held with the casual competence of someone who'd used firearms in anger. "And expensive." Time seemed to slow as Jack's training took over 15 years of combat experience compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. The gunman was good professional, controlled, confident, but he'd made a critical error in assuming that a civilian contractor would freeze when confronted with a weapon. Jack moved as the pistol cleared the jacket, diving left toward the apartment's kitchen island, while simultaneously grabbing a decorative metal sculpture from a nearby side table. The sculpture flew through the air with deadly accuracy, catching the gunman in the wrist just as his finger found the trigger. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar in the confined space, the bullet punching through the apartment's large window in an explosion of glass and night air. The gunman stumbled backward, his weapon clattering across the hardwood floor as he fought to maintain his balance. Catherine screamed, the sound high and sharp with terror, while Marcus and Danny froze in shock at the sudden eruption of violence. Jack rolled behind the kitchen island, using its bulk for cover, while his mind automatically shifted into combat mode. "Call 911!" he shouted to Catherine, hoping she could hear him over the ringing in everyone's ears from the gunshot. "Now!" The gunman had recovered his balance and was reaching for his fallen weapon when Jack exploded from behind the island, closing the distance with the terrifying speed of someone trained to eliminate threats quickly and efficiently. The tackle drove both men to the floor in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. The professional was good. Jack felt the impact of expertly thrown elbows and knees as they grappled for position. But he'd been caught off guard by Jack's reaction, time, and aggression, and close-quarters combat had always been Jack's specialty. Within seconds, he had the man pinned face down with an arm twisted behind his back, at an angle that promised serious injury if he continued to resist. "Stop moving," Jack commanded, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. "Stop moving, or I'll break your arm." Marcus Webb's voice cut through the chaos, pitched high with panic and rage. "You have no idea what you've just done. My father will destroy you. He'll destroy your family." Jack looked up to see Marcus holding Catherine in front of him, like a human shield, one arm wrapped around her throat, while his free hand fumbled in his jacket pocket. Danny stood frozen nearby, his face pale with shock at how quickly their carefully planned intimidation had devolved into open warfare. "Let her go, Marcus," Jack said, his voice deadly calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "This is between you and me now." "No, it's not." Marcus's voice cracked with the strain of someone losing control of a situation he'd believed he could manipulate. "You want to play hero, fine, but she pays the price." The arm around Catherine's throat tightened, and she gasped for air as her face began to turn red. Jack felt the cold calculation of a sniper settling over him, the same mental state that had allowed him to make impossible shots under impossible conditions, in places where failure meant death for his teammates. "Marcus," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "if you hurt her, I will kill you. Not arrest you, not sue you, not complain to your father. I will kill you with my bare hands. Do you understand me?" Something in Jack's tone, perhaps the complete absence of bluster or bravado, seemed to penetrate Marcus's panic. His grip on Catherine loosened slightly, uncertainty flickering across his features. "You're bluffing," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You wouldn't risk going to prison leaving your daughter alone." "Try me." The two words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment The only sound in the apartment was Catherine's labored breathing and the distant wail of sirens approaching from somewhere in the city below. "Shit," Danny whispered, his face going even paler as he recognized the implications of the approaching emergency vehicles. "Marcus, we need to go, now." But Marcus seemed frozen in place, trapped between his need to maintain dominance and his growing realization that Jack Foster was not the same kind of man he was used to intimidating. This wasn't some bureaucrat or businessman who could be controlled through threats and political pressure. This was someone who'd killed people professionally and wouldn't hesitate to do so again if pushed far enough. The sirens were getting closer now, their urgent wail cutting through the night air like a promise of salvation. Jack could feel the professional beneath him beginning to relax, recognizing that the smart play was to surrender and hope that expensive lawyers could minimize the consequences. "Last chance, Marcus," Jack said, his voice still carrying that terrifying calm. "Let her go and walk away, or explain to the police why you're holding a woman hostage in her own apartment." For a moment it seemed like Marcus might choose the violent path, his face flushed with rage and humiliation at being outmaneuvered by someone he considered beneath his notice. But then Catherine spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "Please," she whispered, "just let me go. This doesn't have to get any worse." Something in her voice, the exhaustion, the fear, the simple human plea for mercy seemed to break through Marcus's fury. His arm fell away from her throat, and Catherine stumbled forward, gasping for air as she collapsed onto her knees. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "Not even close." "Yes, it is," Jack replied, not moving from his position atop the professional. "Because if you come near her again, if you threaten my family, if you so much as drive past our neighborhood, I will end you. And unlike you, I don't make threats I'm not prepared to follow through on." The sirens were in the building now, boots pounding up the stairwell, with the urgent rhythm of law enforcement responding to shots fired. Marcus looked around the destroyed apartment, the shattered window, the overturned furniture, the gun lying on the floor, and seemed to finally grasp the gravity of his situation. "Danny," he said quietly, "call my father. Tell him to get lawyers down here immediately." "Already on it," Danny replied, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in rapid, hushed tones to someone on the other end. The apartment door burst open, admitting a flood of uniformed officers with weapons drawn and voices raised in the controlled chaos of a high-stakes arrest. Jack slowly raised his hands, keeping the professional pinned, while making it clear he wasn't a threat to the responding officers. "I'm the one who called," Catherine said quickly, her voice still hoarse from Marcus's chokehold. "These men broke into my apartment. Mr. Foster was trying to help me." As the police sorted through the scene, taking statements and securing evidence, Jack caught Catherine's eye across the chaos of the apartment. She was safe, shaken, but unharmed, and that was what mattered. The rest, the legal consequences, the inevitable retaliation from the Webb family, the disruption to his carefully constructed civilian life, would have to be dealt with as it came. But as he watched Marcus Webb being led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage and the promise of vengeance, Jack knew that the quiet life he'd tried to build for himself and Sophie had just become a casualty of war. The only question now was how much collateral damage there would be before it was over. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast harsh shadows across Detective Sarah Chen's weathered face as she reviewed the incident report for the third time. 22 years on the force had taught her to read between the lines of official statements, and the Foster case reeked of political complications that would make her life infinitely more difficult in the coming weeks. Jack sat across from her in the cramped interview room, his hands clasped loosely on the metal table. Despite spending the better part of 4 hours being processed through the system, he maintained the calm composure that had first caught her attention. Most civilians involved in shootings were either hysterical or trying too hard to appear tough. Foster simply seemed tired, like a man carrying the weight of inevitable consequences. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd heard every possible story about violence and revenge. "You received a phone call from Ms. Mitchell, drove to her apartment building, observed 3 men entering unlawfully, and decided to intervene rather than calling for backup. That's correct. Even though you had no legal authority to enter that building, no warrant, and no reasonable expectation that you could handle 3 armed men without someone getting hurt." Jack's gray eyes met hers steadily. Ms. Mitchell was in immediate danger. The police had already told her they couldn't help because no actual crime had been committed. By the time patrol units responded to a disturbance call, she could have been dead. Chen leaned back in her chair, studying his face for tells that never came. Foster's military background was evident in his posture, his speech patterns, and his unsettling ability to remain calm under pressure. She'd interviewed enough veterans to recognize the type men who'd seen too much violence to be intimidated by interrogation rooms and bureaucratic threats. "The problem, Mr. Foster, is that your version of events is the only one that supports self-defense. Marcus Webb claims you broke into the apartment and attacked them without provocation. Daniel Volkov backs up that story, and their hired muscle isn't talking at all." "What does Ms. Mitchell say?" "Ms. Mitchell's statement corroborates yours completely. But she's also the alleged victim, which makes her testimony potentially biased in the eyes of a jury." Chen tapped her pen against the manila folder containing witness statements, forensic reports, and photographs that would determine the trajectory of Jack's immediate future. "The truth is, without independent witnesses, this becomes a he said, she said situation between you and 2 of the most politically connected men in the city." Jack's expression didn't change, but Chen caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood the implications perfectly. "What are you telling me, Detective?" "I'm telling you that Marcus Webb Sr. owns 3 city council members, has the mayor's personal cell phone number, and contributed more money to the district attorney's last campaign than some small countries spend on their annual budgets." Chen's voice carried a note of resignation that came from years of watching justice bend to accommodate wealth and influence. "I'm telling you that the gun we found in that apartment belongs to a man named Viktor Kozlov, who has never been successfully prosecuted for anything, despite being investigated for murder, extortion, and human trafficking. Meaning that either Marcus Webb is stupid enough to hire a known killer for a simple intimidation job, or this situation is more serious than anyone wants to admit." Chen closed the folder and fixed Jack with a stare that had broken harder men than him. "Which brings me to my real question. What aren't you telling me about your relationship with the Webb family?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Jack had expected it. Eventually, detective work was pattern recognition, and the patterns here pointed to deeper connections than a random encounter in a restaurant. But the truth was more complicated than Chen could possibly imagine, rooted in events that had happened half a world away, and consequences that were still rippling through his civilian life. "There is no relationship," Jack said carefully. "I'd never heard of Marcus Webb before tonight." "Really?" Chen opened the folder again, extracting a photograph that she slid across the table. "Because this suggests otherwise." The image was grainy, obviously taken with a telephoto lens from significant distance, but Jack recognized himself immediately. He was emerging from a black SUV in what appeared to be an industrial area, his face clearly visible despite the poor lighting. The timestamp showed a date from 6 months ago. "I've never seen this before," Jack said, which was technically true, but his mind was racing through possibilities, trying to understand how anyone could have photographed him in a location he'd never been. The photo was found on Viktor Kozlov's phone. Chen continued watching Jack's reaction carefully. Along with detailed surveillance reports on your daily routine, your daughter's school schedule, and financial records for Foster Construction going back 3 years. The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. Sophie's school schedule. Someone had been watching his daughter, cataloging her movements, treating her like a target, rather than a 10-year-old girl whose only crime was having a father who couldn't walk away from trouble. "Detective," Jack said, his voice carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been there before. "I need to call my daughter. I need to make sure she's safe." "She's fine. We've had a patrol unit watching your house since we processed the scene. But Mr. Foster, if someone has been planning this for 6 months, then what happened tonight wasn't random. This was orchestrated." Jack's mind was already shifting into tactical mode, analyzing threats and vulnerabilities with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. If the Webb family had been monitoring him for months, then they knew about his military background, his work schedule, his financial situation, and most importantly, they knew about Sophie. "Why?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Chen pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. "Your service record makes for interesting reading, Mr. Foster. 15 years with the SEAL teams, multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, decorated for valor on several occasions. But there's a gap in your record, 18 months, where your location and activities are classified at levels that require congressional approval to access. That's not unusual for special operations personnel." "No, it's not. But it becomes very interesting when you consider that Marcus Webb Sr. made his fortune through overseas construction contracts, many of them in the same regions where you were deployed." Chen's voice took on the tone of someone connecting dots that had been carefully hidden. Contracts that were awarded under circumstances that raised questions about corruption and bid rigging. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that Jack had hoped never to see again. Webb Industries had been one of the primary contractors for infrastructure projects in Iraq during the height of the war, building everything from military bases to civilian hospitals with cost overruns that had made headlines in congressional investigations. "I was never involved in contract oversight," Jack said carefully. "My job was tactical operations, not procurement." "Maybe not directly, but your unit conducted security assessments for contractor operations, didn't you? You would have seen things documented, problems, filed reports that could have damaged Webb Industries' reputation if they ever became public." Jack remained silent, but his mind was racing through memories he'd tried to bury. Inspections of construction sites where corners had been cut, reports of substandard materials that endangered military personnel, evidence of kickbacks and corruption that had been deemed too politically sensitive to pursue. He'd been a soldier then, following orders and trusting that his superiors would handle the larger implications of what his unit discovered. "Detective, even if what you're suggesting is true, that was over a decade ago. Why would Marcus Webb care about ancient history? Because it's not ancient history. Congressional investigators have been quietly reopening cases related to wartime contracting irregularities. Several high-profile executives have already been indicted, and rumor has it that Webb Industries is next on the list." Chen's expression was grim, the look of someone who'd seen too many cases where justice was delayed but not denied. "If you were to testify about what you observed during your deployments, it could corroborate other evidence that prosecutors have been building." The implications were staggering. Jack had stumbled into something far more complex than a restaurant confrontation, something that reached back through years of carefully buried secrets and political maneuvering. The Webb family hadn't been targeting him because of tonight's incident, Tonight had been their attempt to eliminate a potential threat before he could become a problem. "Have I been contacted by any congressional investigators?" Jack asked. "Not yet. But if Webb Industries is under active investigation, it's only a matter of time." Chen closed the folder again, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Foster, I need you to understand something. The charges against you from tonight, breaking and entering, assault, destruction of property, those are manageable. A good lawyer, some character witnesses, maybe a plea deal that keeps you out of prison. But if you're a potential witness in a federal corruption case, then the people who want to silence you aren't going to be satisfied with legal maneuvering. They're going to use whatever means necessary to protect themselves, and that includes threats against your family." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Jack had faced enemy fire, improvised explosives, and trained killers without flinching, but the thought of Sophie being targeted because of his past was almost unbearable. She'd already lost her mother to forces beyond anyone's control. The idea that his actions might put her in further danger was a kind of torture no amount of military training could prepare him for. "What do you recommend, Detective? Honestly, you pack up your daughter and disappear. Change your names, move somewhere the Webb family can't reach you, and hope that federal prosecutors can build their case without your testimony." Chen's voice carried the weary resignation of someone who'd seen too many good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. "It's not fair, and it's not justice, but it's survival." Before Jack could respond, the interview room door opened to admit a woman in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning battles in courtrooms rather than foreign battlefields. She was probably in her early 40s with silver threading through her dark hair and the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money and serious connections. "Mr. Foster, I'm Rebecca Walsh, your attorney. This interview is over." Chen looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this development. "Counselor, that was fast even for you." "Detective Chen, always a pleasure." Walsh's tone was professionally polite, but carried an undertone that suggested a long history of adversarial encounters. "I trust my client has been treated appropriately during his unlawful detention. Mr. Foster isn't under arrest. He's been cooperating voluntarily with our investigation." "How refreshing. In that case, he's free to leave whenever he chooses." Walsh turned to Jack with the kind of smile that cost $500 an hour. "Mr. Foster, I strongly advise you to exercise that choice immediately." Jack looked between the two women, recognizing the professional tension that crackled in the small room like static electricity. "Ms. Walsh, I don't recall hiring an attorney." "You didn't. Your representation has been arranged by parties who have a vested interest in ensuring that you receive competent legal counsel." Walsh's smile never wavered, but her eyes carried a message that was anything but reassuring. "Shall we discuss the details somewhere more private?" Chen stood up, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon before stopping as professional discipline overrode instinct. "Mr. Foster, if you walk out of here with her, you're on your own. The department can't protect you from what's coming." "And what exactly is coming, Detective?" Walsh's voice carried the razor-sharp precision of someone trained to dismantle opposition through superior preparation and relentless logic. "People who hire killers to solve their problems don't stop just because their first attempt failed," Chen replied bluntly. "Mr. Foster has stumbled into something that's been building for years, and the people responsible aren't going to risk exposure because of one man's inconvenient conscience." Walsh's expression didn't change, but Jack caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested Chen's words had hit closer to the truth than was comfortable. "Detective, I think you've been reading too many conspiracy theories. Mr. Foster was involved in a simple altercation that got out of hand. Nothing more, nothing less." "Then explain the surveillance photos. Explain why Viktor Kozlov had detailed intelligence on Mr. Foster's family. Explain why someone would hire a professional killer for a simple altercation. I explain it by noting that Mr. Kozlov is facing serious federal charges and has every incentive to fabricate evidence that might reduce his sentence. As for the photographs, anyone can take pictures of anyone else in public spaces. It proves nothing except that Mr. Kozlov has too much time on his hands. Jack listened to the verbal sparring with growing unease. Both women were clearly skilled professionals, but their agendas were obviously in conflict. Chen seemed genuinely concerned about his safety, while Walsh was focused on damage control for parties unknown. "Ms. Walsh," Jack said quietly, "who exactly is paying for your services?" "Attorney-client privilege prevents me from disclosing the specific details, but I can assure you that your legal interests are being well represented." "That's not what I asked." Walsh's smile faltered slightly, revealing a glimpse of the calculation beneath her professional facade. "Mr. Foster, there are people in this city who believe that justice should be served regardless of political connections or family wealth. They want to ensure that you have the resources necessary to defend yourself against any charges that might be filed. People like congressional investigators." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jack saw something flicker in Walsh's eyes that might have been surprise or approval. Chen leaned forward in her chair, recognizing that the conversation had just shifted into territory that could determine the outcome of much larger issues. "Mr. Foster," Walsh said carefully, "there are ongoing federal investigations into various matters related to wartime contracting. If you were to be contacted by federal prosecutors, I would strongly advise you to cooperate fully with their inquiries. And if that cooperation puts my family at risk, then we would take appropriate measures to ensure their safety." Walsh's voice carried the kind of certainty that suggested resources far beyond what a small-town attorney could provide. The federal government has extensive experience protecting witnesses in high-profile cases. Chen made a sound that might have been a laugh or a snort of derision. "Witness protection. For a construction contractor who happened to serve in the military 15 years ago, counselor, that's either remarkably optimistic or deliberately misleading. Detective, I think you underestimate the significance of Mr. Foster's potential testimony. His unit conducted security assessments that documented serious irregularities in contractor performance irregularities that resulted in substandard construction and endangered military personnel." Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again. The reports his unit had filed weren't just bureaucratic paperwork. They documented decisions that had cost lives, American lives, because contractors had prioritized profit over the safety of the people they were supposed to be protecting. "How many people died because of those irregularities?" he asked quietly. Walsh's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of genuine emotion beneath her professional armor. "According to the congressional investigation, at least 14 servicemen and women died in building collapses or accidents that were directly attributable to substandard construction practices. Dozens more were injured." The number hit Jack like a physical blow. 14 people soldiers like the ones he'd served with people with families and dreams and futures dead because someone had decided that cutting corners was more profitable than following safety regulations. "Mr. Foster," Chen said gently, "I can see what you're thinking, but you need to consider what's best for your daughter. Sophie needs her father alive and free, not martyred for a cause that might not succeed anyway. She also needs to live in a world where people are held accountable for their actions." Jack replied, his voice carrying a note of steel that hadn't been there before. "Where powerful families can't silence witnesses through intimidation and violence." Walsh nodded approvingly. Mr. Foster, if you're willing to testify, the federal government is prepared to offer you and your daughter full protection. New identities, relocation assistance, financial support, until you can re-establish your business in a new location. And if I'm not willing, then you're free to return to your normal life, and we'll do our best to ensure that tonight's incident doesn't result in any criminal charges. Walsh's tone was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear: cooperation would be rewarded, while refusal might result in complications that would make his current legal troubles seem minor by comparison. Jack closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of the decision he was being asked to make. On one hand, testifying could provide justice for the soldiers who died because of Webb Industries' corruption and might prevent similar tragedies in the future. On the other hand, it would mean uprooting Sophie from the only home she'd ever known, destroying the stable life they'd built together, and placing her in a federal protection program that would cut them off from everything familiar. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Unfortunately, time is a luxury we don't have," Walsh replied. "The Webb family is already mobilizing their resources to discredit your testimony and eliminate you as a threat. Every hour you delay gives them more opportunity to succeed." "How long do I have?" 24 hours. After that, the federal prosecutors will have to proceed with the evidence they already have, and your window for protection will close. Chen stood up, her expression grim. "Mr. Foster, whatever you decide, I recommend you stay away from your house tonight. We'll maintain patrol coverage, but if the Webb family is as desperate as I think they are, uniformed officers might not be enough deterrent." Jack nodded, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. Sophie was safe at Mrs. Henderson's house for now, but that was a temporary solution at best. He needed to get her somewhere secure while he figured out how to navigate the minefield his life had become. "Ms. Walsh, if I agree to cooperate, when would the federal marshals take custody?" "Immediately. We have a safe house prepared, and your daughter would be picked up from school tomorrow morning by agents posing as family friends. Within 48 hours, you'd both be relocated to a secure facility where you could begin the process of assuming new identities." The clinical efficiency of the plan was both reassuring and terrifying. The federal government had clearly been preparing for this possibility for months, waiting for the right moment to approach him with an offer that would be difficult to refuse. "And if something goes wrong, if the Webb family finds us before the relocation is complete," Walsh's expression hardened. "Mr. Foster, the people who are offering you protection have successfully hidden witnesses from organized crime families, international terrorists, and foreign intelligence services. Marcus Webb Sr. may be wealthy and politically connected, but he's not omnipotent." Jack wasn't entirely convinced, but the alternative was returning to his normal life while pretending that nothing had changed, hoping that the Webb family would be satisfied with the message they'd already sent. Given Viktor Kozlov's surveillance files and the months of preparation that had obviously gone into tonight's confrontation, that seemed like a dangerously naive assumption. "Detective Chen, what happens to Ms. Mitchell if I cooperate with the federal investigation?" "Catherine Mitchell will receive the same protection offers you're being given. Her testimony about tonight's events could corroborate the pattern of intimidation that prosecutors are trying to establish." Chen's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there earlier. "She's already agreed to testify, by the way. Whatever you decide, she's committed to seeing this through." The revelation surprised Jack. Catherine had every reason to want this nightmare to end quietly, to resume her legal career without the complications that came from challenging one of the city's most powerful families. The fact that she was willing to risk everything for the sake of justice spoke to a moral courage that humbled him. "Ms. Walsh, I want to speak with Ms. Mitchell before I make my decision." "That can be arranged. She's currently at a secure location, but we can facilitate a phone call within the hour." Jack stood up, feeling the weight of 15 years of military service and 3 years of civilian life pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The decision he made in the next 24 hours would determine not just his own future, but Sophie's childhood. Catherine's career and potentially the outcome of a federal investigation that could bring justice to families who'd lost loved ones to corporate greed. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning," he said finally. "But I want to see my daughter first. I want to explain what's happening in terms she can understand." Walsh nodded. "We can arrange a secure meeting. But Mr. Foster, I need you to understand that once you leave this room, there's no guarantee we can protect you until you formally enter federal custody. The Webb family has resources and connections that extend into every level of law enforcement. I understand the risks, but Sophie deserves to hear this from me, not from strangers who show up at her school claiming to be family friends." Chen opened the door, her expression troubled. "Mr. Foster, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Those soldiers who died deserved better than what they got, and their families deserve answers." As Jack walked out of the police station, into the pre-dawn darkness, he felt the familiar sensation of stepping into hostile territory without adequate intelligence or support. But this time, the stakes weren't measured in tactical objectives or strategic advantages. They were measured in a 10-year-old girl's future and the possibility that justice might finally be served for people who died far from home in service to their country. The city around him seemed different now, transformed from a place of refuge into a potential battleground where the lines between right and wrong were drawn in blood and shadow. But as he thought about Sophie's trusting smile and Catherine's courage in the face of overwhelming odds, Jack Foster knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The war he'd thought was over was just beginning, and this time he was fighting for something more precious than national security or political objectives. He was fighting for the kind of world he wanted his daughter to inherit, a world where power couldn't silence truth, where justice wasn't for sale, and where ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary corruption without paying the ultimate price. The first pale light of dawn was breaking over the city skyline when Jack pulled into Mrs. Henderson's driveway, his hands trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. The elderly widow had been their neighbor since he and Sarah had first bought the house on Oak Street, and in the 3 years since Sarah's death, she'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to Sophie. If anyone could be trusted with his daughter's safety during the chaos that was about to engulf their lives, it was Eleanor Henderson. The front porch light was already on, and Jack could see movement behind the lace curtains that adorned the living room windows. Mrs. Henderson had always been an early riser, a habit formed during 50 years of marriage to a man who'd worked the morning shift at the steel mill. But today, Jack suspected her wakefulness had more to do with concern than routine. Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s whose silver hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour. Eleanor Henderson possessed the kind of timeless dignity that came from weathering life's storms with grace and determination, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing when it came to the welfare of those she considered family. "Jack Foster," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. "You look like hell warmed over." "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Henderson." Despite everything that had happened in the past 8 hours, Jack found himself smiling at her directness. "I hope Sophie wasn't too much trouble." "That child is never trouble, and you know it. But she's been asking about you every hour since you dropped her off yesterday evening. She knows something's wrong even if she's too polite to say so directly." Eleanor stepped aside to let him into the warm, cluttered living room that smelled of coffee and the kind of homemade cookies that had comforted 3 generations of neighborhood children. "Coffee's fresh, and Sophie's still sleeping, but she left strict instructions to wake her the moment you arrived." Jack settled into the familiar armchair that had been designated as his spot during the countless evenings he'd spent here while Sarah was undergoing chemotherapy treatments. Eleanor had been their lifeline. Then watching Sophie when hospital visits ran late, and providing the kind of steady presence that had kept their family anchored during the darkest period of their lives. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound crazy." Jack accepted the steaming mug she handed him, grateful for the simple ritual of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become anything but normal. "Sophie and I might have to leave town for a while, maybe permanently." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Jack caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was preparing for bad news. "What kind of trouble are you in, son?" The endearment hit him harder than expected. Mrs. Henderson had been calling him son since the day he and Sarah had moved in, treating them like the children she'd never had. The thought of leaving her behind, of cutting Sophie off from the only grandmother figure she'd ever known, was almost as painful as the prospect of entering witness protection. "The kind that might get us both killed if we stay." Jack's voice was steady, but the words felt like broken glass in his throat. "I got involved in something last night that goes back to my military service. There are people who want to make sure I can't testify about things I witnessed overseas." Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression shifting from concern to the kind of steely determination that had seen her through a husband's death, a son's deployment to Vietnam, and countless neighborhood crises over the decades. "How long do you have?" "The federal marshals want to take us into custody this morning. New identities, relocation, the full witness protection program." Jack set down his coffee mug, his hands shaking slightly as the magnitude of what he was asking Sophie to sacrifice began to sink in. "She'll have to leave her school, her friends, everything she's ever known." "But she'll be alive," Eleanor said quietly. "And she'll have her father. That's what matters most." Before Jack could respond, the sound of bare feet on hardwood announced Sophie's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, wearing the same unicorn pajamas from the night before, that her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes bright with the kind of alertness that suggested she'd been awake for some time. "Dad!" She launched herself across the room and into his arms with the unconscious trust of a child who'd never had reason to doubt her father's ability to protect her from the world's dangers. "I was so worried about you. Mrs. Henderson said you had to help the lady from the restaurant, but you were gone all night." Jack held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence that had sustained him through 3 years of single parenthood. "I'm sorry I was gone so long, sweetheart. There were some complications that took longer to sort out than I expected." Sophie pulled back to study his face with the uncomfortable perceptiveness that never failed to amaze him. "You look tired and sad. Did something bad happen to the lady?" "No, baby. The lady is safe, but we need to talk about some things that are going to affect both of us." Jack glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded encouragingly. "Why don't you sit down?" Sophie settled herself on the couch, tucking her feet under her in the way she'd inherited from her mother. Her expression was serious now, recognizing the gravity in her father's tone with the intuitive understanding of a child who'd already experienced loss. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" "We might be. Do you remember when I used to tell you stories about my time in the Navy? About how sometimes soldiers have to do difficult things to protect people who can't protect themselves?" "Yeah, you said being a soldier meant standing up for what's right even when it's scary." "That's exactly right. Well, it turns out that some of the things I witnessed when I was overseas might help put some very bad people in jail. People who hurt American soldiers by building unsafe buildings." Sophie's brow furrowed in concentration. "Like the lady at the restaurant, you stood up for her when those men were being mean." Sort of like that, yes. But these bad people are very powerful, and they don't want me to tell anyone what I know. They might try to hurt us to keep me quiet. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Jack watched as understanding dawned in Sophie's eyes. She was only 10, but she'd grown up listening to news reports about war and terrorism, and she understood that the world contained people who did terrible things for incomprehensible reasons. "What do we have to do, Dad?" The simple question asked without fear or accusation nearly undid him. Sophie's absolute trust in his ability to handle whatever crisis had emerged was both humbling and terrifying. She believed he could protect her from anything, and he wasn't entirely sure that faith was justified. There are some federal agents like police officers, but for the whole country who want to help us. They can give us new names and move us to a place where the bad people can't find us. But Sophie, if we do that, we can't ever come back here. We can't see Mrs. Henderson or your friends from school or anyone else we know. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the careful consideration of someone far older than her years. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but steady. "Would we still be together, you and me?" "Yes, sweetheart. Always. No matter what happens, we'll be together. And we'd be helping to catch the bad people who hurt soldiers. Yes, my testimony could help put them in prison where they can't hurt anyone else." Sophie nodded solemnly, her young mind working through the moral calculus, with the clarity that came from having been raised by parents who believed in service and sacrifice. "Then we have to do it, even if it's scary." The declaration hit Jack like a physical blow filled with the kind of courage that had nothing to do with training or experience and everything to do with an innate understanding of right and wrong. At 10 years old, Sophie possessed a moral clarity that humbled him. "Are you sure, baby? Once we make this choice, there's no going back. You'll never see Jefferson Elementary again, never see your friends, never get to visit Mom's grave." At the mention of Sarah, Sophie's composure finally cracked slightly. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Mom always said that doing the right thing wasn't supposed to be easy. She said that's how you know it's right, because it costs you something important." Mrs. Henderson, who had been silent throughout the conversation, cleared her throat gently. "Sophie, honey, why don't you go get dressed? Your father and I need to talk about some grown-up things." Sophie nodded and headed toward the stairs, but paused at the doorway. "Dad, when you were a soldier, did you ever have to leave people behind?" "Sometimes, sweetheart. It was always the hardest part. But you did it anyway because it was your job to protect people." "Yes." "Then this is like that. This is your job now." She climbed the stairs with the deliberate steps of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for her years. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Mrs. Henderson turned to Jack with an expression that mixed pride and heartbreak in equal measure. "That child has more wisdom in her little finger than most adults manage in a lifetime. She gets it from her mother." Jack's voice was thick with emotion. Sarah would have made the same choice, would have seen it as a moral imperative rather than a personal catastrophe. "And what do you see it as?" Jack was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee as if the dark liquid might contain answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. "I see it as the price of having a conscience, of being unable to walk away when people need help, even when helping them destroys everything you've built." "Do you regret it? Intervening at the restaurant last night?" "No, but I regret that Sophie has to pay the price for my choices." Jack set down his mug and met Mrs. Henderson's eyes. "She's going to grow up in hiding, always looking over her shoulder, never able to form the kind of deep friendships that come from knowing option will be there tomorrow, and next year, and 10 years from now. Mrs. Henderson reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft with age, but her grip was firm, anchored by decades of providing comfort to those who needed it most. Jack, that child upstairs just showed you something remarkable. She's not just your daughter, she's your partner in this. She understands what you're fighting for, and she's choosing to stand with you. Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd raised children and grandchildren and neighborhood strays for most of her adult life. Don't rob her of the dignity of making that choice by treating her like a victim. Before Jack could respond, his phone rang. Rebecca Walsh's number appeared on the screen, and he answered with a sense of inevitability that came from knowing there was no longer any way to delay the moment of decision. "Mr. Foster, I trust you've had time to consider our conversation." "I have. My daughter and I are ready to enter federal protection." "Excellent. There's a car outside Mrs. Henderson's house right now. Don't be alarmed. There are people. They'll escort you to a secure location where you can speak with Catherine Mitchell before the final arrangements are made." Jack moved to the window and peered through the lace curtains. A black sedan sat at the curb, unremarkable except for the slight tint to the windows and the way it was positioned to provide maximum visibility of the surrounding area. Professional, subtle, reassuring in its competence. "How long before the pickup?" 30 minutes. That should give you time to pack essentials and say your goodbyes. Walsh's voice softened slightly. "Mr. Foster, I know this isn't easy, but what you're doing could prevent other families from losing loved ones to corporate negligence." "I understand. We'll be ready." Jack ended the call and turned to find Mrs. Henderson watching him with an expression that mixed sorrow and pride. 30 minutes to pack up 10 years of life in this house. "The important things don't fit in suitcases anyway," she said gently. "Memories love the lessons you've taught each other. Those travel with you no matter where you go." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, now dressed in jeans and her favorite sweater, the one Sarah had knitted during chemotherapy treatments, when her hands needed something productive to occupy them during the long hours of medical appointments. She carried a small backpack that seemed to contain everything she considered essential for an uncertain future. "I'm ready, Dad." "That's all you're bringing." Mrs. Henderson said the important things don't fit in suitcases. Sophie descended the stairs with careful steps as if she were walking into a new life with each footfall. "I brought Mom's locket, the picture of all three of us from my birthday last year, and the book of poems she used to read to me." Jack felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah's funeral. His daughter had distilled her entire childhood into a few precious objects that connected her to the mother she'd lost and the family they'd once been. "What about your stuffed animals? Your art supplies, all the things in your room?" "They're just things, Dad. You taught me that. You said Mom took the important parts of herself with her when she died, and the important parts of us would go with us wherever we go." The wisdom in her words was almost unbearable. At 10 years old, Sophie understood something about loss and sacrifice that many adults never grasped, that identity and love transcended physical possessions, that home was a feeling rather than a place. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her movements careful but determined. "Before you go, there's something I want you both to have." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small wooden box that Jack recognized from her mantelpiece. It had belonged to her late husband, containing the mementos of his service in Korea and the letters they'd exchanged during his deployment. "Eleanor, I can't." "Yes, you can. Harold would have understood what you're doing, and he would have approved." She opened the box to reveal a tarnished silver medal and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "This is his silver star. And these are the letters I wrote to him every day for 18 months while he was overseas. She removed the medal and pressed it into Jack's palm. For courage in the face of impossible odds, Harold earned it at Chosen Reservoir, fighting an enemy that outnumbered his unit 20-1. But he said later that the real courage came from the decision to serve, knowing that it might cost him everything he held dear. The weight of the medal in Jack's hand was insignificant compared to the weight of what it represented. Sacrifice duty, the willingness to pay any price for principles that transcended personal safety or comfort. Mrs. Henderson, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. You're doing the right thing, even if it costs you everything. Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Mrs. Henderson's waist, holding on with the desperate intensity of someone saying goodbye forever. I love you, Grandma Eleanor. I'm going to miss you so much. I love you too, sweet girl. And I want you to remember something. No matter where you go or what name you use, you'll always be Sophie Foster to me. You'll always be the little girl who helped me plant tomatoes in my garden and who made me cookies every Christmas. The sound of car doors closing outside signaled that their escort had arrived. Jack looked around the living room one final time, memorizing the details of a place that had provided refuge and comfort during the darkest period of his life. The photographs on the mantelpiece, the comfortable furniture worn smooth by decades of use, the sense of safety and belonging that had made this house a sanctuary, all of it would soon be nothing more than memory. It's time, he said quietly. Sophie shouldered her backpack and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of absolute trust and unwavering loyalty. Ready when you are, Dad. As they walked toward the door, Mrs. Henderson called out one final time. Jack, that little girl of yours is going to grow up to change the world. Make sure she never forgets where she came from. The agents waiting outside were professional and courteous, treating Sophie with the kind of gentle respect that suggested they understood the magnitude of what she was sacrificing. The drive through the city took them past familiar landmarks that would soon exist only in memory, the park where Sophie had learned to ride a bicycle, the library where they'd spent countless Saturday mornings, the cemetery where Sarah rested beneath a simple granite headstone. The safe house was located in an unremarkable suburban neighborhood, indistinguishable from thousands of similar developments across the country. But inside, Jack found Catherine Mitchell waiting in a comfortable living room that had been carefully designed to feel temporary, furnished, but not personal, functional, but not homey. Catherine rose as they entered, her face lighting up with genuine relief at seeing them safe. Jack, Sophie, I'm so glad you're all right. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger and less intimidating than she had in her professional attire at the restaurant. But there was something different about her demeanor, a sense of resolve that hadn't been there the night before, as if the events of the past 12 hours had crystallized her understanding of what was at stake. Ms. Mitchell, Sophie said, with the polite formality her mother had drilled into her, I'm sorry those bad men scared you. Thank you, sweetheart. And please call me Catherine. She knelt down so they were at eye level, treating Sophie with the respect due to an equal rather than a child. I want you to know that what your father did last night was very brave. He helped me when no one else would. He's always brave, Sophie replied matter-of-factly. Mom said it's because he has a good heart, and good hearts can't ignore people who need help. Catherine's eyes met Jack's over Sophie's head, and he saw understanding pass between them. Recognition of the price that good hearts paid in a world where helping others often came with devastating consequences. Catherine, Jack said, I need to know what we're really walking into. The federal prosecutor, Rebecca Walsh, she painted a picture of guaranteed protection and successful prosecution, but that seems optimistic given what we're up against. Catherine's expression grew serious. The truth is, nothing about this is guaranteed. The Webb family has resources and connections that run deeper than most people realize. Marcus Webb Sr. didn't build his empire through legitimate business practices alone. She gestured for them to sit on the comfortable sectional sofa that dominated the living room. But the federal investigation has been building momentum for months. They have financial records, testimony from other witnesses, and physical evidence of safety violations that resulted in military casualties. How many other witnesses? 7 so far, including us. Former military personnel, defense contractors, even some current Webb Industries employees who've grown disgusted with what they've seen. Catherine's voice carried a note of steel that suggested she'd already committed herself fully to this path. Jack, what we witnessed was just the tip of the iceberg. Webb Industries has been systematically cutting costs on military construction projects for over a decade, and the casualties have been mounting. Sophie had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up with the directness that always surprised adults who underestimated her comprehension. How many soldiers died because of the bad buildings? Catherine hesitated, clearly debating how much truth a 10-year-old could handle. We don't know the exact number yet, sweetheart, but it was more than it should have been. More than 0, Sophie said with the absolute moral clarity of childhood. Any number more than 0 is too many. That's exactly right, Catherine replied, her voice thick with emotion. And that's why what your father is doing is so important. He's going to help make sure those soldiers didn't die for nothing. Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his civilian life. For 3 years, he'd focused on building a quiet existence for himself and Sophie, avoiding the kind of moral complexity that had defined his military service. But sitting in this anonymous safe house, preparing to sacrifice everything for the sake of justice, he realized that he'd been hiding from himself as much as from the world. When do we meet with the federal prosecutors? He asked. Tomorrow morning. They want to debrief you extensively before the Webb family's attorneys have a chance to mount a defense. Catherine's expression was troubled. But Jack, there's something else you need to know. Marcus Webb Jr. made bail this morning. The news hit Jack like a physical blow. How is that possible? He was caught red-handed threatening you in your own apartment. His father's attorneys argued that he was intoxicated and not thinking clearly, that his actions were the result of poor judgment rather than criminal intent. The judge set bail at $2 million, which the Webb family paid within an hour of the hearing. So he's free to continue threatening witnesses. Theoretically, he's under house arrest with electronic monitoring, but given his family's resources and connections, I wouldn't count on that being much of a deterrent. Catherine's voice carried the grim realism of someone who'd seen justice bent to accommodate wealth and influence too many times. The federal marshals are treating this as a high-priority case, but they're also realistic about the challenges we're facing. Sophie had been processing the conversation with the intense concentration she brought to difficult concepts. Dad, if the bad man is out of jail, does that mean he might try to hurt us again? Jack looked at his daughter, seeing Sarah's fierce intelligence combined with a courage that humbled him. It means we have to be very careful, baby. But the federal agents are going to protect us, and we're going to help them make sure the bad people can't hurt anyone else. Like the soldiers who died. Like the soldiers who died. Sophie nodded with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred trust. Then we're doing the right thing, even if it's scary. As afternoon faded into evening, the three of them settled into the strange rhythm of life in protective custody. Sophie did homework from the materials the federal agents had retrieved from her school, while Jack and Catherine reviewed documents and prepared for the extensive interviews that would begin the next morning. But underneath the surface normalcy, Jack could feel the weight of what they'd committed themselves to, a battle against one of the most powerful families in the country, with stakes that extended far beyond their personal safety. They were fighting for the memory of soldiers who'd died in foreign lands, for the principle that money couldn't purchase immunity from justice, and for the kind of world they wanted Sophie to inherit. As night fell over the safe house, Jack stood at the window looking out at a suburban street that could have been anywhere in America. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of disappearing from their old lives and emerging as new people with fabricated histories and careful lies. But tonight, they were still themselves, Jack and Sophie Foster, a father and daughter who'd chosen principle over safety, justice over comfort. Sophie appeared at his side, her small hand slipping into his with the trust that had sustained them both through the darkest periods of their lives together. "Dad, are you scared?" "Terrified," he admitted, "but also proud. Proud of you. Proud of the choice we're making. Proud to be fighting for something that matters." "Mom would be proud too, wouldn't she?" "Yes, baby. She would be proud of both of us." They stood together in the gathering darkness, a father and daughter, on the threshold of an uncertain future, bound together by love and a shared commitment to the kind of courage that cost everything and bought the possibility of justice. The war for their old lives was over, but the battle for their souls and for the souls of the soldiers whose deaths demanded answers was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of a modest farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills of Montana, casting golden light across a breakfast table where 3 people had found an unexpected kind of family. Jack stirred pancake batter, while Sophie, now officially Emma Carson, set the table with the careful precision she'd inherited from her mother. Catherine, whose new identity papers listed her as Sarah Carson, reviewed case files that would soon reshape American military contracting forever. The transformation had been remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. Sophie had adapted to her new name with the resilience of childhood, though Jack still caught her pausing sometimes when people called her Emma, as if she were translating between her old self and the person she'd become. Her hair was shorter now, dyed a soft brown that made her look older and somehow more serious, but her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that reminded him daily of Sarah. "Dad. I mean Michael." Sophie corrected herself with a small smile that suggested the slip had been intentional. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can help with the school fundraiser next week. They need someone to build the auction display booth." Jack nodded, flipping pancakes with the automatic precision of someone who'd mastered the domestic routines that now defined his existence. "Tell her I'll stop by after work to look at the space." The normalcy of the conversation masked the complexity of their situation. Michael Carson worked as a carpenter for a local construction company, a cover identity that allowed him to use his skills while maintaining the low profile that kept them all alive. But every morning brought new testimony in the federal courthouse, 800 miles away, where the case against Webb Industries was slowly, methodically building toward a conclusion that would determine whether their sacrifices had been worthwhile. Catherine looked up from her files, her face grave with the weight of what she'd been reading. "The prosecution rested their case yesterday. Closing arguments begin Monday." The announcement hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. For 6 months, they'd lived in a kind of suspended animation, knowing that their old lives hung in the balance of a legal proceeding. They could only follow through carefully filtered reports from Rebecca Walsh and the federal marshals assigned to their protection. "What are the chances?" Jack asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "Better than I dared hope 6 months ago," Catherine replied, but her expression remained troubled. "The evidence is overwhelming: financial records, safety inspection reports, testimony from families who lost loved ones. But the Webb family's legal team is extraordinary, and they've managed to cast doubt on some of the key witness testimony." Sophie had been listening with the intensity she brought to all discussions about the case that had redefined their lives. At 11 now, she possessed an understanding of justice and corruption that far exceeded her years, shaped by direct experience with both the best and worst aspects of human nature. "What about your testimony?" "Catherine, did that help?" "I think so, sweetheart. But the defense attorneys tried very hard to make it seem like I was just an angry lawyer trying to get revenge for what happened at the restaurant." Catherine's voice carried a note of frustration that came from watching skilled professionals twist truth into something that served their clients' interests. "They painted your father as a violent man who overreacted to a simple misunderstanding." Jack felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever he thought about the Webb family's attempts to rewrite history. But the anger was tempered now by the knowledge that his testimony, had helped expose a pattern of negligence and corruption that had cost American lives for over a decade. "The important thing is that the truth is finally on the record," he said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Sophie. "Whatever the jury decides, the families of those soldiers finally know what really happened to their loved ones." It was a sentiment he'd repeated countless times over the past 6 months, partly to convince himself that their sacrifices had been worthwhile regardless of the legal outcome. The life they'd built in Montana was good, quiet, honest, grounded in the kind of simple values that had sustained him through military service and single parenthood. But it was also built on a foundation of lies, false identities, and the constant awareness that discovery could mean death. Catherine reached across the table and touched his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the months of shared exile. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, shaped by mutual respect, and the kind of understanding that came from facing danger together. She'd become more than Sophie's surrogate mother. She'd become the partner Jack had never dared hope to find after Sarah's death. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly, her eyes meeting his with an expression that mixed hope and apprehension. "Rebecca called this morning. The jury reached a verdict." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. After 6 months of waiting, of living in limbo between their old lives and whatever future awaited them, the moment of truth had finally arrived. "When will we know?" "The verdict will be read at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, 1 hour from now." Sophie set down her fork, her appetite apparently forgotten in the face of this momentous news. "What happens if they find the bad people guilty?" "Then your father's testimony will have helped put them in prison where they can't hurt anyone else," Catherine replied gently. "And the families of the soldiers who died will finally have justice. And if they don't?" The question hung unanswered in the morning air. They'd all thought about it, planned for it, but none of them wanted to voice the implications of an acquittal. The Webb family would emerge more powerful than ever, vindicated in their belief that money and influence could overcome any challenge to their authority. The witnesses who'd testified against them would remain forever marked, forever vulnerable to retribution. Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Walsh. "Verdict in 30 minutes. Call when you're ready." He showed the message to Catherine, who nodded grimly. The next hour would determine not just the outcome of a legal case, but the shape of their lives for whatever time remained to them. "Sophie," Jack said carefully, "why don't you go upstairs and work on your art project?" Catherine and I need to make some phone calls. Dad, I want to stay. This is about our family, about why we had to leave everything behind. I have a right to know what happens. The words were spoken with such dignity and conviction that Jack found himself nodding, despite his instinct to protect her from the harsh realities of adult consequences. Sophie had earned the right to witness the conclusion of the journey they'd undertaken together. Okay, baby. But whatever happens, we face it together. Catherine dialed Rebecca Walsh's number and activated the speaker function, filling the farmhouse kitchen with the tinny sound of a long-distance connection. The federal prosecutor's voice was carefully controlled, professional, but Jack could hear the underlying tension that came from months of preparation, leading to this single moment. Are you all ready for this? Walsh asked. As ready as we'll ever be, Jack replied. Good. I'm in the courthouse now, and the atmosphere is incredible. The victim impact statements from military families were devastating. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Marcus Webb Sr. looked like he'd aged 10 years by the time we finished presenting evidence of what his company's negligence cost this country. Through the phone, they could hear the background noise of a crowded courthouse, voices, footsteps, the institutional sounds of justice grinding toward its conclusion. Somewhere in that chaos, 12 ordinary citizens were preparing to deliver a verdict that would ripple through corporate boardrooms and military families across the nation. Walsh, a voice called in the background. They're ready. Here we go, Rebecca said. I'll stay on the line so you can hear everything in real time. The next few minutes passed in a blur of legal procedure and formal language that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what was being decided. Jack reached for Sophie's hand while Catherine gripped his shoulder. The three of them united in a moment of shared tension that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge's voice was clear and authoritative, carrying easily through the courtroom and across the miles to their Montana kitchen. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States government, how do you find the defendant, Marcus Webb Sr.? A pause that seemed to last forever, followed by words that would be etched in Jack's memory for the rest of his life. Guilty, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps, the sound of justice finally being served after years of delay and obfuscation. Sophie squeezed Jack's hand so tightly it hurt, while Catherine pressed her face against his shoulder to muffle a sob of relief. On the charge of criminal negligence resulting in death, how do you find the defendant, Marcus Webb Sr.? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of racketeering and organized criminal activity, how do you find the defendant, Marcus Webb Sr.? Guilty, Your Honor. The verdicts continued guilty on 17 separate counts, each one representing years of criminal activity that had finally been exposed to the light of justice. Marcus Webb Jr. received similar treatment, convicted on charges ranging from witness intimidation to conspiracy. Even Victor Kozlov, the professional killer they'd hired, was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. When the formal proceedings concluded, Rebecca Walsh's voice returned to the phone, thick with emotion and exhaustion. Jack, Catherine. Sophie, what you did made this possible. Without your testimony, without your willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth, the Webb family would have continued destroying lives for decades to come. What happens now? Catherine asked. Now they go to prison. Marcus Webb Sr. is looking at life without parole. His son got 40 years. The company will be dissolved, their assets seized to pay restitution to the families of the soldiers who died. Walsh's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. And you're free to go home if that's what you want. Home. The word hung in the air like a prayer half remembered. For 6 months, home had been this farmhouse in Montana the life they'd built as the Carson family, the routines and relationships that had sustained them through uncertainty and fear. But their old life, their real names, their actual history, was waiting for them 800 miles away, like a door that had been closed but not locked. "We need some time to think about it," Jack said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The Webb family's power is broken, their network dismantled. You're as safe now as you'll ever be." After ending the call, the three of them sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd just experienced. Justice had been served, the guilty punished, the victims vindicated. But the victory felt strangely hollow, tinged with the knowledge of everything they'd lost to achieve it. "So we can go home now?" Sophie asked quietly. "Back to our real house, back to our real names." Jack studied his daughter's face, looking for signs of what she truly wanted beneath the surface of the question. She'd adapted remarkably well to their new life, making friends at the local school and embracing the rural lifestyle with enthusiasm. But he could see the longing in her eyes for the bedroom, where her mother's presence still lingered, for the neighbors who'd known her since birth, for the simple continuity of being Sophie Foster instead of Emma Carson. "We can go back if that's what you want, baby. But we can also stay here if this feels more like home now." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her young mind wrestling with questions that would have challenged adults twice her age. When she finally spoke, her words carried the wisdom that had sustained them all through the darkest moments of their journey. "I want to visit home. I want to see Mrs. Henderson and Mom's grave and all the places where we used to be happy. But I think this is home now, isn't it? This place where we helped catch the bad people, where Catherine became part of our family, where we learned how to be brave together." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Sophie's words. Over the months of shared exile, she'd become more than a fellow witness. She'd become the mother figure Sophie needed, and the partner Jack had never dared hope to find. Their relationship had grown slowly, naturally built on mutual respect and the kind of deep understanding that came from facing danger together. "What do you think, Catherine?" Jack asked. "Montana or our old life?" "I think home is wherever the three of us are together," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I also think Sophie's right. We should visit the places that shaped us, pay our respects to the people who loved us enough to let us go when we needed to." Over the following weeks, they made the journey back to their old city, traveling under heavy federal protection, despite the convictions that had broken the Webb family's power. The homecoming was bittersweet, filled with reunions that underscored how much they'd all changed during their months in exile. Mrs. Henderson had aged visibly during their absence, but her embrace was as fierce as ever when Sophie Emma no longer ran into her arms on the familiar front porch. The elderly woman had followed the trial obsessively. She told them, taking pride in the courage her surrogate family had shown, even as she mourned their absence from her daily life. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice shaking with emotion as she held Sophie close. "Not to stay, perhaps, but to show me that you were all right, that you'd found your way through the darkness." They spent 3 days in their old neighborhood, visiting Sarah's grave, walking through the house that now seemed smaller, somehow reconnected with friends and neighbors who'd followed their story through carefully filtered news reports. Sophie spent hours in her old bedroom, talking to the empty space as if her mother's spirit still lingered there, processing the journey they'd taken and the choices they'd made. But it was at Sarah's graveside that the full weight of their transformation became clear. Jack knelt beside the simple granite headstone, while Sophie placed a bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked from the Montana hills. Catherine stood quietly behind them, giving them space for a private goodbye that felt more like a beginning than an ending. "Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet cemetery. "We did it. We helped catch the bad people just like you would have wanted us to. And we found Catherine who takes care of us the way you used to." Jack felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to his daughter's words. Sarah would have been proud of them, proud of Sophie's courage, proud of his willingness to fight for justice, proud of the family they'd managed to create from the ashes of tragedy and loss. "We're going back to Montana," he said quietly. His words addressed as much to Sarah's memory as to the granite stone. "Not because we're running away anymore, but because that's where we belong now. That's where we learned how to be happy again." The flight back to Montana felt different, not the desperate escape of 6 months earlier, but the purposeful journey of people who'd found their place in the world. Sophie chattered excitedly about seeing her new friends again, about the art project she'd left unfinished, about the school play auditions she'd missed during their trip east. Catherine had been quiet during most of the journey, but as their plane descended toward the small airport that served their rural county, she reached for Jack's hand with a gesture that spoke of permanence rather than temporary comfort. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Choosing a life in the middle of nowhere, with a man and a child who come with more baggage than most people could handle." "I'm sure," Jack replied, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become natural over their months together. "You're not just choosing us, we're choosing each other. All three of us as a family." The farmhouse welcomed them back with the scent of pine and wildflowers, the sound of wind through wheat fields, and the sense of peace that came from knowing they were exactly where they belonged. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen, where they'd learned the verdict that changed everything, Jack felt a contentment that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. Sophie was setting the table when she paused, struck by a sudden thought. "Dad, what are we going to do about names? I like being Sophie again, but I also like being Emma Carson. And Catherine's been Sarah to everyone here for months." It was Catherine who answered, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. "What if we became the Carson family for real, not because we're hiding, but because that's who we've become? Sophie, Emma Carson, Catherine, Sarah Carson, and Jack Michael Carson. Would that make you my mom?" Sophie asked the question, carrying a weight of hope and uncertainty that made Jack's chest tight with emotion. "If you'd like me to be. Not to replace your real mom, but to be the mom you have now, the one who'll help you with homework and worry about you when you're late and embarrass you at school functions." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "I think I'd like that. I think real mom would like it too." She always said family wasn't just about blood, it was about people who choose to love each other no matter what. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Jack and Catherine sat on the front porch of their farmhouse watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The silence between them was comfortable, the ease of two people who'd found their way to each other through circumstances that had tested every aspect of their character. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked. "Everything we gave up, everything we lost." Jack considered the question carefully, thinking about the life he'd left behind, the business he'd built, the community where he'd been known and respected, the simple certainty of being Jack Foster, instead of navigating the complexity of dual identities. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that Sophie had to grow up faster than any child should. I regret that we lost time with people we loved." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "But I don't regret the choice we made. I don't regret fighting for justice or finding you or learning that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing love and principle over safety and comfort." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. Sophie was right, about this being home. Not because of the place, but because of what we built here together. A family, Jack said quietly. A family, she agreed. 6 months later, they stood together in a small chapel surrounded by friends from their Montana community, people who knew them as the Carson family, who'd watched them heal and grow and create something beautiful from the fragments of their separate tragedies. Sophie served as maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd helped design and carrying a bouquet that included flowers from Sarah's favorite garden. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, grounded in the kind of authentic emotion that came from people who'd tested their love under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. When Jack and Catherine exchanged vows, they weren't just promising to love each other. They were promising to continue building the life they'd created together, to honor the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment, to raise Sophie in a home where courage and compassion were daily practices rather than abstract ideals. As they kissed for the first time as husband and wife, the sound of applause filled the small chapel. But Jack was aware only of Sophie's delighted laughter and Catherine's tears of joy. They'd found their way through darkness to something that felt like grace, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of love strong enough to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The reception was held in the community center, where Jack had built the stage for Sophie's school play, where Catherine had organized fundraisers for local charities, where they'd all learned that home wasn't just a place but a network of relationships built on mutual care and shared purpose. Mrs. Henderson had flown out for the wedding, and Jack found her during the reception, sitting quietly in a corner and watching the celebration with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed a miracle. "Thank you," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "for everything you gave us, everything you taught us about what family really means." "Don't thank me," she replied, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank Sarah. She's the one who taught you how to love completely, how to sacrifice everything for the people who matter most. You just had to remember how to apply those lessons in a world that had become too complicated for simple answers." Later that evening, as the three of them returned to their farmhouse, now officially the Carson family home, Sophie surprised them both with a gift she'd been working on in secret for weeks. It was a painting executed with the skill she'd inherited from her mother, and the emotional depth that came from having lived through experiences that would have broken many adults. The image showed 3 figures standing together on a hillside beneath a vast sky. A man, a woman, and a child holding hands and facing toward a sunrise that painted the world in shades of gold and promise. But above them, barely visible in the brushstrokes that suggested clouds and light, was a 4th figure, a woman with gentle eyes and an expression of infinite love watching over the family that had emerged from loss and found their way to wholeness. "It's all of us," Sophie explained as they studied the painting together. "Our family. The one we were, the one we are, and the one we're going to be." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized Sarah's face in the protective spirit hovering above them. His daughter had found a way to honor the past while embracing the future, to acknowledge loss while celebrating the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. "It's perfect, sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice thick with tears. "We'll hang it in the living room where we can see it every day and remember how blessed we are to have found each other." That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Jack and Catherine stood together in their bedroom, their room now officially and forever, and spoke quietly about the future they would build together. Catherine's legal career was thriving in their new state, where her reputation for integrity and courage had made her a sought-after advocate for families seeking justice against powerful interests. Jack's construction business was growing steadily, built on the foundation of honest work and fair dealing that had sustained him since leaving the military. But more importantly, they were raising Sophie in an environment where she could grow into the remarkable woman she was destined to become: confident, compassionate, grounded in the values that had carried them all through their greatest challenges. "Do you think she'll remember?" Catherine asked. "When she's older, do you think she'll remember why we made the choices we did?" "I think she'll remember that when the moment came to choose between safety and justice, between comfort and courage, her family chose to stand up for what was right," Jack replied. "I think she'll remember that love isn't just about protecting the people you care about. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything to create a world worthy of their trust." Outside their window, the Montana night was filled with the sounds of a world at peace: wind through grass, the distant call of nightbirds, the profound silence that came from being far from the corruption and violence that had once threatened to destroy them. But inside their home, the silence was different, not empty, but full of the contentment that came from people who'd found their way through darkness to something that felt like grace. In Sophie's room, a little girl who'd lost one mother and found another slept peacefully, surrounded by art supplies and books, and the accumulated treasures of a childhood that had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances, but anchored in extraordinary love. She dreamed perhaps of the painting she'd created of families that transcended blood, and biology of love that was stronger than fear of courage, that transformed the world one small act of justice at a time. And in the morning, they would wake as the Carson family, not because they were hiding from their past, but because they'd chosen to embrace a future built on the foundation of everything they'd learned about love, sacrifice, and the price of standing up for what was right. The war was over, the battles won, the victory, measured not in conquest, but in the quiet triumph of good people who'd refused to let evil have the final word. They had found their way home, not to a place but to each other, and to the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth rebuilding a life around. In a world that often seemed dark and complicated, they had created something simple and true, a family bound not by biology or circumstance, but by the conscious choice to love each other completely, courageously, and without reservation. The story that had begun with violence in a restaurant had ended with a wedding in a chapel. But the real victory was measured in smaller moments: bedtime stories and homework help, shared meals and quiet conversations, the daily decision to choose love over fear and hope over despair. They had learned that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but about the courage to do what was right when no one was watching, to protect the vulnerable when the cost was almost unbearable, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. Sophie. Emma Carson would grow up knowing that her family had changed the world, not through conquest or dominance, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to look away when others needed help. She would carry that lesson into her own life, into her own moments of moral choice, armed with the unshakable knowledge that love was stronger than fear, that justice was worth any sacrifice, and that home was wherever people chose to stand together against the darkness.